LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Rick Strassman, who joins us to discuss his book DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, a new science of spiritual revelation in the Hebrew Bible. After completing his groundbreaking research chronicled in DMT, the spirit molecule, Strassman was left with one fundamental question. What does it mean that DMT, a simple chemical naturally found in all our bodies, instantaneously opens up to us an interactive spirit world that feels more real than our own world? When his decades of clinical psychiatric research and Buddhist practice were unable to provide answers to this question, Strassman began searching for a more resonant spiritual model. He found that the visions of the Hebrew prophets such as Ezekiel, Moses, Adam, and Daniel were strikingly similar to those of the volunteers in his DMT studies. Carefully examining the concept of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, he characterizes a prophetic state of consciousness and explains how it may share biological and metaphysical mechanisms with the DMT effect. Examining medieval commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, Strassman reveals how Jewish metaphysics provides a top-down model for both the prophetic and DMT states, a model he calls theoneurology. Theoneurology bridges biology and spirituality by proposing that the divine communicates with us using the brain, and DMT, whether naturally produced or ingested, is a critical factor in such visionary experience. This model provides a counterpoint to neurotheology, which proposes that altered brain function simply generates the impression of a divine human encounter. Theoneurology addresses issues critical to the full flowering of the psychedelic drug experience. Perhaps even more importantly, it points the way to a renewal of classical prophetic consciousness, the soul of Hebrew Bible prophecy, as well as unexpected directions for the evolution of contemporary spiritual practice. Hello and welcome, Rick, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, thanks for having me on your show today, Greg.
Rick, today we're going to talk about your latest book, which is entitled DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. Subtitle is A New Science of Spiritual Revelation in the Hebrew Bible. Before we dive into that, just tell listeners a bit about your background and your work and how you became interested in psychedelics in the first place.
Well, let's see. I guess I had an academic background, which involved the public schools in Los Angeles, and then undergraduate training on the West Coast. I was always interested in psychedelic research, or I became interested in psychedelic research during my college days and decided that the best way to pursue that was in medical school. So I attained my MD on the East Coast and then returned to the West Coast. So I completed my training in general psychiatry and then got some additional training in psychopharmacology research, which then enabled me to do some studies of pineal melatonin in humans and then to branch out into the DMT work. In terms of my interest in psychedelics, as I mentioned, it kind of began during my undergraduate days when I was really struck with the descriptions of the psychedelic drug state, both within the academic community and among my friends in school. It, seemed like you could take a small amount of LSD, for example, and attain all kinds of incredible visions, and insights and out-of-body experiences, those kinds of things. At around the same time, there was this influx of Eastern meditation techniques, which also promised the same kinds of effects, maybe not quite as spectacular, but at least qualitatively in the same ballpark. And so that began me considering the common biological denominators that might underlie, both, syndromes. It, seemed to me that perhaps, there was, something in the brain that was activated or turned on by both, by both specific meditation practices, and by the psychedelic drugs. So that kind of got me, interested in the pineal as a spiritual organ, and then DMT as a, naturally occurring, potential spiritual kind of molecule. From my own religious, kind of background, which I guess would, comprise, my background in general, I was raised in a Jewish, household in Southern California in the 1950s and 60s, and then branched out, I guess, so to speak, or left the fold and embarked upon a 20+ year course of practice and study of Zen Buddhism. And Zen, a lot more than Judaism, at the time anyway, influenced my spiritual mindset with which I approached the DMT research.
Yes, and listeners may know of you from, as I say, your previous book, the DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and that documents some experimental work that you did, and that was quite pioneering, really, at the time. I'm not sure if what the current state of psychedelic research is, but certainly that was groundbreaking work that you undertook.
Yeah, let's see. So I studied DMT between 1990 and 1995. And at the time, that was the first new study with humans with these drugs in the U.S. in a generation. And I completed those studies, I guess, almost 20 years ago now. And in the meantime, there's been quite a resurgence of clinical research, with these substances. There's a group at Imperial College in the UK, for example, studying LSD and psilocybin. There's Spanish studies of ayahuasca. There's a lot of studies in the U.S. using psilocybin. There's only been one study giving pure DMT since my study finished up. And that was a paper, also that was a study described in a paper from Germany that came out in, I think 2005 or so.
Now, perhaps when turning to discuss your new book, we should say, basically give listeners the underlying premise, because it's quite an original one to say the least, and also perhaps say something about neurotheology versus theoneurology, which again kind of underpins the main idea of the book.
Yeah. So after I completed my study, I was puzzled on a number of accounts, based on the reports from my volunteers. On one hand, I was expecting the Buddhist Enlightenment experience as the peak effect of a high dose of DMT. And the Enlightenment experience within Buddhism is a content-free, formless, ego-free state. The sense of self dissolves into the white light. There's no content, there's no time or space, there's no sense of self. It's nonverbal, non-perceptual. And in the case of my DMT volunteers, it was full of content. And it was extremely interactive. And the sense of self was maintained quite firmly, quite strongly. And one's ability to maneuver and interact with that state, was intact, if not even more intact than usual. In addition, I was expecting the volunteers to appraise the state as a drug-induced state. Like with respect to LSD or psilocybin, one is aware of having taken a drug, and no matter how, far out there, one still is able to distinguish between reality and the state that the drug induces. But in the case of DMT, the volunteers almost uniformly, instead of describing the state as less real than real or drug-induced, they felt it was as real, or even more so, than everyday reality. And it was in that way extremely different than other drug states, dreams, hypnosis, any other kinds of subjective effects that they had undergone previously from any other technology. So those were the two phenomenological kinds of questions facts that emerged from the study that weren't consistent with my preconceptions. So I started looking around for other models, than the Buddhist model, or the brain chemistry model, or even the psychological model, to, contextualize the DMT experience. And I was looking for models, which could, describe the reality basis, of the state, or that, extremely strong, feeling of reality, in addition, to the contentful, nature of the experience. So I began, looking at other scientific models, for example, those of dark matter, parallel universes, those kinds of things. So that still didn't quite answer the more overarching question, which was, what these states are good for, and, why the system is configured in, such a way, that this naturally occurring compound in the body, when given in, higher than, normal doses in an experiment, could transport people, into this particular, experience of perceiving an alternate freestanding, parallel level, of reality. So, there was the reality basis, which all three of my previous models discounted. The brain chemistry model describes the DMT effect as your brain on drugs. The psychological model, posits, that these are just, visualizations of unconscious processes. And the Buddhist model, proposes, that the visions are, kind of detritus, being shed on the way towards the formless enlightened state. So the, so the high, so some of the newer, models, within physics were able to, mechanistically explain the, possibility of freestanding realities, but didn't quite, tap into the existential reason, for their existence, or, why DMT in the body could provide that. And also what the states are good for, in other words, if DMT could provide access to other realms, then so what, more or less. So I then, decided to turn, to the religious, traditions, which have also, looked at invisible worlds, but they've also tried to extract, meanings and, messages, from those invisible worlds, in order to obtain ethical information, theological information, those kinds of things. So, I've already discussed, I've already discussed, some of the shortcomings, of Buddhism. Latin American, shamanism also, occupies itself with these, kinds of questions, but, it isn't, quite ready for prime time within the larger Western culture. So then I started thinking about returning to my own roots and began reading the Hebrew Bible. And, the notion of the prophetic state, began to emerge.
Yes, you mentioned shamanic tradition there, and there's a lot of talk these days about ayahuasca, and, there's such a thing as ayahuasca tourism now, which I'm sure you're aware of. But since really, its advent in the 60s, the Western psychedelic experience, as you pointed out, has kind of lacked meaning. A lot of psychedelic experience has been done for recreational reasons, basically. And that's something that comes across very strongly in your work, is that there is meaning here in this experience, but, how to extract it, how to interpret the experience.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Up until perhaps, 10 years ago, it was the Buddhist or Eastern religious model, which, people used to frame, to integrate, to understand, to extract any information, from their psychedelic states. If, they were looking for a spiritual model, for that, for those purposes. If you go into any head shop, there's statues of Buddhas, and bodhisattvas, and there's Tibetan, bells. There's posters of mandalas and those kinds of things. And, the last, several years, I would imagine, although it's been a long time since they've gone into a head shop, that there would be, the comparable, paraphernalia, within the Latin American shamanic context, bells and rattles and whistles and, posters of the Amazon. And if you go to Burning Man and you have a bad experience on a psychedelic, drug, you go to the Zendo to chill. And, the Zendo is the Buddhist meditation hall in a Zen monastery. So it's just, kind of, crept into the lay culture, the popular, culture that, the only way to frame these experiences, if you're looking at them from a spiritual perspective, is with a, non-Western model, or at least a non-modern Western model, or a, non-traditional Western model. For example, why isn't the, chilling off place in Burning Man called, the temple or the tabernacle or the tent of meeting? So I think it's become unconsciously kind of integrated into the contemporary, psychedelic subculture. It isn't only in the psychedelic subculture, though. It's also, seeped into the academic study of these drugs. Because if you look at any of the research which is going on, with these substances in humans, all of them are kind of geared towards expecting and coach their volunteers or their subjects to experience the unitive state, the unitive mystical state, where everything is one, the ego dissolves, there's the white light, there's no content, it all feels fantastic, everything makes sense, but there's no verbal content to speak of. So I think the academic world has also been co-opted, with the Eastern, New Age model, as it were, as opposed, to the interactive, relational, contentful, experience, which, is the underlying one of the Bible, which is the which is the foundational text, for half of the world's population.
Yeah, I think particularly in the West, the mainline religions, particularly Christianity, they've become so tainted in many people's minds. We're very disengaged, from religion. More people than ever declare, I know the situation's somewhat different in the US, but more people than ever declaring themselves not religious. That any idea that there could be any connection between this sort of profound experience and anything that goes on in a church, it just seems to be, worlds apart.
Well, yeah, and that's a good point. What goes on in a church is worlds apart. But that is because of what's been done, to the texts. They've been interpreted and used, for the purposes of the institutions, which, survive on and rely upon the authority of the text, for their existence. In my current work, I'm primarily referring to the Hebrew Bible, as opposed, as opposed, to the more, recent developments that have grown around it. For example, Talmud and Midrash and the rabbinic tradition and Kabbalah and all those things. Because I think as a result of getting, further from the text, you get further from the tradition, or, from the foundation. And the foundation of the texts is, usually, built around, the religious experience of the founder. in the case of the Hebrew Bible, you're looking at a text, that was, which was either received and or, laid down within a prophetic state of mind. So if you read the text and you resonate, with it, theoretically you would be resonating with the state of mind out of which the text emerged in the first place. And when you start getting into the minutiae of the rituals which the church, or, the later institutional accretions, have, developed, you get further from that state and you get, more into the politics and the authority and greed and, violence and, those kinds of problems.
Yeah, just for listeners who are not aware, when we're referring to the Hebrew Bible, we're talking about the Old Testament, which is sort of more popularly known.
Right. That's a good point. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's quite all right. I mean, you're correct, but just so people have got something to hang this on. Now, I have not read very much of the Bible at all. Maybe some passages that we did during religious education at school, but I do have one friend, and she read all of the Old Testament because she was interested, just because so few people do it. So few people ever bother, and she was struck mainly by the darkness, the violence, and this notion of a vengeful God and how contradictory it was. But you address some of this in your book.
Yeah. So there's a, number of issues, which are involved in any attempt, to read and understand the Bible. Well, first of all is the issue of translation. Most of the English translations of the Hebrew Bible which are in circulation are translated by Christians. The Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew, and there's no vowels, there's no accents, there's no punctuation. So one's translation of the text is, necessarily an interpretation. It isn't, strictly speaking, an exact translation. It's an interpretation because you have to pick and choose among, the various options, for how to translate certain words, how to punctuate, the sentences, and, how to vowelize the consonants. So that's, one thing of, great importance is, the nature of the translation. For example, Christian Bibles or, Christian, translations of the Hebrew Bible are being undertaken with the assumption, that Jesus was the Messiah. And, that kind of, takes into a whole ball of wax. In other words, humans are not able to approach God, individually on their own, that it requires the, intermediation of a Messiah figure. And that isn't at all implied or explicit in the Hebrew Bible. Also, a Christian interpretation or translation of the Bible would be reading quite a few of the predictions and the allegories in the Hebrew Bible as foretelling the birth and resurrection and crucifixion of Jesus. And, so none of that is implicit in the Hebrew Bible either. And when you are thinking about a vengeful God or an angry God, it's important to interpret, it's important to, be able, to have access, to commentaries on the text. It's an extraordinarily, difficult, text, to penetrate. It would almost be like somebody opening up a book of surgery and, reading, the procedures and seeing the photographs and thinking, this is completely nuts. You're cutting people open and taking out their organs? That makes no sense at all. And you would just be angry and you'd close it. As opposed to if you started in college and you learned some anatomy and biology, you went to medical school and, learned about pathology, pharmacology, those kinds of things. Then you became a, surgical resident. So you really, need to start with the basics when you're looking at the Hebrew Bible. And you need to educate yourself in reading it and understanding where it comes from. And in, my, case, I, learned about the medieval Jewish, philosophers and commentators, who lived between, the turn of the Common Era and around 1600 or so. So they, exert themselves, mightily in, helping you understand what the individual words mean, or what the sentences mean, the context. They explain, things that don't make sense or they're contradictions. So, one of, the concepts, that they, present or teach is, that of reward and punishment, as described in the Bible. And they, point out, that God, as the creator and sustainer of existence, created both the natural laws of the universe and the moral laws of the universe. And within, the natural laws, you can see the operation of, cause and effect. If you throw a match into a dry, forest, it'll start on fire. So that's, cause and effect. You wouldn't, cause, or you wouldn't call that, punishment by God for misbehaving. Although if you were living, 10,000 years ago, you might. So it, partakes of this notion called anthropomorphizing. You apply human features to non-human things. So for, example, if you're angry at, somebody and you stub your toe and you hurt, are you being punished, for having the angry thought, or is it, simply the manifestation of a very, complex, net of cause and effect? So I started to think about the notion of God actually within the Buddhist context of the world of cause and effect. Cause and effect is supposed to be impersonal. Things are now because of how things were before. But if you look, more carefully at everyday life, cause and effect, seems geared, towards encouraging certain behaviors and discouraging others. So for example, if I'm angry at somebody, why doesn't that, cause me to grow an extra nose, for example, as opposed to stubbing my toe? So you could explain how me being angry might allow me to grow an extra nose, but that wouldn't really, explain, why things are, set up that way. But, things are, set up in a specific way, that if you are angry, you stub your toe, and it discourages you from being angry. So in quite a few ways, it's, comparable, to the natural law. There are, causes of effects, but, within the, social, theological, interactive kind of world, you look at them as moral laws rather than natural laws. But ultimately, they're the same thing, it seems to me. And you're just, putting human terms on, moral, or, you're putting human terms on the operation of, cause and effect. In other words, if I got angry and I stubbed my toe, one could, it's easier to look upon that as an example of being, punished, for having a bad thought. And, God is an angry, punishing God. But at the same time, if you dissect it, you could look at it as, the consequence of a, vast array of invisible, but, just as real moral laws as the ones, which regulate nature.
Yeah, it's this idea of karma, isn't it? And I think that people like to talk these days, moral relativism, but I think people innately, as human beings, we understand the difference between good and evil. And it's not, we can't say that, oh, well, it depends on your perspective. I think underlying that, there is something, and even something meaningful. And even I've talked to quite hardened atheists who will grudgingly acknowledge that there does seem to be some kind of law in operation. It might not happen to, an evildoer in this lifetime, but what goes around comes around. It's just something that seems inherent to us, religious or not.
Right. And, that whole concept of what, goes around comes around, yeah, that is a convenient, way to express an exceedingly, complex, web of interactions, at the spiritual level, at the moral level, at the interpersonal level, psychologically, socially. But ultimately, yeah, it is cause and effect. I mean, you can personalize, cause and effect. You can get angry at the vengeful, match for starting a fire. But, that, wouldn't make sense. So the whole concept of reward and punishment is a, convenient, simplification. But, I think it stirs up all kinds of reactions, similar, to the one that you described your friend went through. So it is a vast area, but I think if you can, number one, step away from things a bit, and number two, think about, the notion of anthropomorphizing, phenomena. In other words, putting human, traits or activities around, otherwise impersonal kinds of, behaviors.
Now, the core of your book is you have drawn comparisons between the prophetic state as laid down in the Hebrew Bible and the DMT, the psychedelic experience. Now, first of all, perhaps I could just get you to say something about prophecy, because again, for most people, that's exclusively predicting the future, and it's not as simple as that. And obviously you can't go through all the different comparisons that you made in the book, but perhaps you could maybe touch upon some of the categories that you used and just say something general about what conclusions you drew.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so that is a good point about my definition of the prophetic state, or of, prophecy. Yeah, because most people think of, prophecy as predicting or foretelling, but that is an artifact of translation once more. The Greek translation of the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, it's called the Septuagint. It chose to translate the Hebrew word navi into prophetes. So navi is the Hebrew word for prophet. And, if you look at the root of navi, it means interpreter, explainer, communicator, that kind of, idea. And if you look at the root of prophetes, which is the Greek translation of navi, it means, someone that foretells the future. And, that's because, for the Greeks, the spiritual experience was used primarily, for foretelling. But, the Hebrew word, more refers to the spokesman-like, properties of the Hebrew prophet. He or she is a spokesman for God, as opposed to a, predictor of future events. One of the indicators of a true versus false, prophet is predicting, but, false prophets can predict. And there are other ways, to accurately, predict, without using prophecy. Like, for example, if you're a meteorologist, you can predict the future with a fair degree of accuracy. If you expand the notion of being a prophet or the prophetic state, to encompass any spiritual experience as recorded as taking place in a figure in the Hebrew Bible, any visions, any voices, any inspiration, any new ideas, physical, feelings, emotional states, out-of-body experiences, the kinds of things which, people include in any, full definition of spiritual experience. If you expand the definition of the prophetic state in that way, it, takes it out of the realm of, the canonical prophets like Ezekiel and Isaiah, Jeremiah, and extends it into anyone who encounters any, spiritual kind of, subjective experience, within the text.
And of course, the one conclusion to take away from this is that if there are genuine similarities here between these two states, then perhaps there's a new lens with which to view the psychedelic experience today. And perhaps rather than some, wacky visions and visuals, there might be meaning in there, as I mentioned earlier, if we can find a new way to understand the experience.
Yeah, I mean, your question about the comparison is germane. Because when I first, came across, this idea of comparing the prophetic state and the DMT state, I was mostly struck with the phenomenological, similarities. For example, there's quite a few, visual phenomena in the prophetic state. The colors, are, seen, which are comparable, to the colors in the DMT state. Blues, reds, yellows, oranges. They're intensely saturated, which occurs in both states. They're rapidly moving. There's quite a bit of, fire described in the visions of the Hebrew Bible, which are, comparable to the swirling, pulsating, shifting, visions in the DMT experience. In the beginning of the, prophetic state, there's a sound like a whistle or, like a rushing of waters. And, that's also quite, similar to what occurs in the onset of the DMT experience. There's out-of-body experiences in both states. There's fear. There's anxiety. There's a lot more ecstasy, I suppose, in the DMT effect than the prophetic one. But that may, be more related, to the message which is contained in the prophetic state, which is often, kind of, gloomy, as compared, to the more, for example, generic, psychological, message which occurred in the DMT volunteers. There can be, shaking in both states. The visions, can include the experience of eyes. For example, in Ezekiel's, vision, the beings are, covered with eyes on their wings. And, there are eyes in the DMT visions as well. If you want to, get a quick, hit of the, similarities between the DMT effect and those of a, bona fide, prophet in the Bible, the first, book of Ezekiel, is a great place to start. It's an extremely psychedelic, description of Ezekiel's initiatory vision. But as I compared, the two states, more carefully, they seem to be different, as well as being, comparable. They shared a lot of similarities when it came, to the content, to the visions and the voices and the physical feelings, but, there was one specific issue or one specific category which, began to become clear as I compared the states more carefully, and I call that relatedness. In other words, it was a description of the nature of the interactions, between the person having the experience and the contents of the experience. In the case of the Bible, it was interactions between the prophet and God or God's angels. In the case of the DMT effect, it was the interactions between the volunteer and the beings that they encountered, in the DMT state. And these beings, could, take any, form or shape. They could be humans or humanoid. They could be like robots. They could be plants, insects, reptiles, mammals, birds, even furniture, even geometric objects. So as I started, comparing the nature of, the relationships, described in the prophetic state compared to the DMT one, the prophetic states, began to look a lot, more superior, as it were, a lot more refined, complex, sophisticated. The nature of the interactions were, much, more, highly articulated and well developed, than in, the DMT effect. So as I looked even closer, it, seemed, that the, main, function, of, the relationship, in either of these states was the communication of information. And when I started to, compare, the information content of the two states, then the prophetic one, seemed even more superior in, terms of the profundity of the kinds of information that people in the prophetic state, returned with. If you look at the, if you look at, the prophetic message, it's endured for thousands of years. It's influenced every level of Western civilization: law, ethics, morality, theology, science, philosophy, finance, economics, poetry, wisdom, architecture. I mean, everything. But if you look at the, message content of, the DMT, or maybe not the DMT state, but, as a specific example of the psychedelic state, its influence has been, primarily in the realm of aesthetics. Even the computer, revolution isn't really an advance in human, wisdom. It's an advance in, technology, and it's pretty, and it makes you, it can be inspiring. But in, terms of, the verbal information which has come down, it isn't anything new. And as we were talking about earlier, it's mostly been interpreted or, couched in, New Age and Eastern religious vocabularies and, concepts and images. So, that, gets around to answering your question, or, addressing, the point that you made about, the text, the Hebrew Bible can provide a lens or an interpretive key to extracting information, from, the psychedelic state. And it also can help, prepare somebody for entering into it. If you learn about the nature of relationships between the prophet and between angels, or, between the prophet and angels, or between the prophet and God, you can learn how to interact with the beings, for example, in the DMT state. You can learn how to ask questions. You can learn, to recognize what you're seeing. You can learn how to, understand what's being told to you, those kinds of things. And if you're prepared to, enter into that state with, more background, more knowledge, which is consistent with your background, your upbringing, your culture, perhaps even your genetics, I think you might be better equipped, to extract valuable information, from your psychedelic experiences.
I think such experiences do change people forever. I mean, in my experience, that's the case. But the only thing that, again, just speaking from my own experience, that people seem to take away from it is they'll talk about, it's almost a cliche now, about the interconnectedness of everything. So they'll come away with a sense of that, and it does affect, how people choose to live, I think.
Yeah, I agree. But still, that's kind of, kindergarten understanding in, some ways, or, like it's true. But, 2 and 2 equals 4 is true as well. But, that isn't, the same as, calculus, or, like a more sophisticated, more applicable, use or actualization, of spiritual insights. You can look around and determine that, things are interconnected, and you can feel that at a deeper level, through meditation or through the psychedelic, drug state. But what do you do with that? And, for example, there's the golden rule. And, the golden rule, is a revealed, truth. If you believe the Jewish, tradition, it is, one that wouldn't be otherwise, attainable, through thinking about it simply. You would need to be told it, from an outside source, like a spiritual outside source, and things are interconnected, so that would lead you to investigate or, or discover the golden rule. And, once you learn about the golden rule, you can then, look at the application of the golden rule within the context of, for example, Jewish law as, laid out in the Hebrew Bible. There are quite a few, laws and, regulations which concern themselves, with interactions, between humans and between humans and the natural world. And all of those devolve, from a deep understanding of the golden rule. Like another, common, takeaway that, people get from the psychedelic, drug state is, that all is one. And, that is true. But, what do you do with that exactly? And you can look at the text of the Hebrew Bible, and you could look at his description of God as one. And, then, that could start on, so that could then start you on the route to understanding what that means. And, how that would affect your relationship with God, as God interacts with the world, in, terms of how, God, created and sustains the world as it is right now. So you might be able to begin with those insights that you attain on the psychedelic, drug state, which are, kind of simple. And, then you can develop them into a more, complex, fulsome, way of interacting with the material and the spiritual worlds.
Pure speculation here, but just thinking about the prophetic experience with regards to DMT, did you ever consider if it was possible, I mean, how would we ever verify this, but that the pineal gland could have been more active in the past?
Well, you're speaking, to, the issue of the pineal as being a, source of endogenous or, naturally produced DMT. And, it's important to, point out that the lungs are the primary source of DMT. That's been known for, 50, almost 60 years probably by now.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I know. Most people get, interested in the pineal gland for a number of reasons and then, kind of, forget about the lungs as, the primary source of DMT. Yeah, and I had speculated about the, presence or the production of DMT in the pineal in my first DMT book, but it was pure speculation at the time. Thankfully within the last, couple of years, a new study demonstrated the presence of DMT in the pineal. So, that, theorizing has been, validated. But even if you don't have a pineal gland or even if it's, primarily, quiescent, there are the lungs. And it, could be that people in the prophetic state were in the throes of a higher than normal level of DMT in their bodies. And I think, that makes sense to the extent that the two phenomena resemble each other. To the extent that the naturally occurring prophetic state shares features with the state brought on by giving DMT, you can speculate that there must be some, some common underlying, denominator. And, that could be, simply enough, an increased amount of DMT in the body of the prophet, or perhaps an increased, sensitivity, to, the DMT that's normally there, in the body of the prophet. But even if that were the case, that only explains the content, of the states, the DMT state or the prophetic state. Doesn't concern itself with, two other questions. One is, why is the, activity of DMT in the prophet or somebody experiencing the prophetic state greater, and also it doesn't concern itself with the message content, with the information which is being beheld or apprehended in within the altered state. In our studies, it's clear that the increase in DMT was the result of the infusion of the drug, through the vein into their system. In the case of the prophetic experience, I'm speculating, that stimulation comes, from above rather than from below. And, that, kind of speaks, to the difference between, theoneurology, which is a top-down model, and, neurotheology, which is a bottom-up, kind of model. In the top-down model, it's God who ultimately is, the final arbiter of, who attains the prophetic state. And it would, be through spiritual influence, from the outside, on to the person, that would increase, the activity of the DMT in the system in the person. And also the content, would be, transmitted, from the outside as well, as it were. But at the same time, there's, this notion of the imaginary, faculty and of the rational faculty. The contents of the DMT and prophetic state are played out in the rational faculty. The rational faculty is what's, considered the intellect. It's in the more abstract ideas as opposed to the, feelings and the perceptions and, the bodily effects which are contained in the realm of the imaginative, faculty. And I'm not speaking of imaginative, faculty as, made up. I'm more, thinking of it as, the contents, of the body, as it were. According to the medievalists, based on Aristotle, the imaginative is the more, physical, of the two faculties. So DMT in, my conception, the metaphysics of DMT, as it were, would state, that DMT is stimulating the imagination. It enhances the production of these, visions and these voices and, so on. According, to the medievalists, you need to have an extremely well-developed or extremely, high-functioning imaginative faculty and rational faculty. And you really aren't able to stimulate, the rational faculty in any other way, than through education and through training and through practice. And in the prophetic state, there's, the downflow or the spiritual efflux, as it were, from God or, from divinity, which is activating a, highly developed, rational faculty and imaginative, faculty. So in the case of giving DMT, from below, there isn't any, compensation made for, or there isn't any, there isn't any stimulation of the rational faculty. So the volunteers were, they were using their intellect to extract whatever information, that they could, from the DMT state, but they were kind of, limited, as a result of their models. And in, the prophetic experience, one is, pious, believes in God, wants to serve God, has, perfected and, developed their intellect, so, when their intellect, is, called upon to extract information of the visions which are residing in the imaginative, faculty, it's able, it's, able to do so, in a, more exacting, more sophisticated manner.
Thinking practically about these sort of experiences, there's a couple of ideas that you take into consideration. Again, very speculative, but absolutely fascinating. Thinking about the objective reality that people feel that is inherent in this experience, you ask the question, okay, where might this be if it's an objective reality? And you point out, of course, that we've lost over 95% of the universe into dark energy and dark matter. There might be something in there. And also, if there's an objective reality here, is it possible for us to, I think you used the term to capture an image of it. Is there some way that someone else could experience it apart from the person actually undergoing the experience? I'm reminded of the film, I don't know if you've seen it, this movie called Brainstorm, where they devise this apparatus to capture people's subjective experiences. And they capture things like an orgasm and other sort of meaningful experiences, and they also eventually end up capturing someone's death, which turns out to be disastrous. But it's, I say, high octane speculation, but really, really fascinating.
Yeah, it would be interesting if one, could develop, for example, a, camera which is able to capture images of dark matter or, parallel universes. Because if indeed, dark matter is, 90%, of, the mass of the universe, there isn't any reason to believe that it isn't inhabited, or, that there aren't, things in it which, can be seen if you've got the, proper, perceptual apparatus. So it would be of interest, at, some point in the future, to develop, for example, a dark matter camera, capture images and then, compare those, to the DMT state images. And if, they were similar, I mean, obviously that would be some objective, validation, of, the existence and the nature of the DMT world. If it didn't, comport, I don't think it would, prove anything, because, there are obviously, a large number of, parallel universes out there. But still, if, they did comport, you would have hit the jackpot. But at the same time, I don't think, our inability to capture I don't think that our inability to capture objective images, should necessarily inhibit our interest in these states, because, people have been, looking at, dreams for, for thousands of years. Nobody's, has, taken a picture of, somebody else's dream. So in, some ways there is no objective reality to dreams because it's a purely subjective experience. But at, the same time, billions of people have talked about their dreams. There's a, consistency, to dreams, so, that, still, provides the access, to the dream state, to study associated phenomenon, to, look at the contents, for all kinds of reasons.
Can I just get your thoughts on the legal situation with regard to psychedelics as it stands now? Because obviously it's been in flux for some time. And I was disturbed, actually, to learn a couple of weeks ago, I had a guest on, we were talking about psilocybin and mushrooms. And I hadn't been aware until that point that they were actually made illegal in the UK and as recently as 2005. And I can't think why, what would have been behind that. There wasn't any upsurgence in, this stuff in the news. And so that's very discouraging. But as you pointed out, there is psychedelic research still ongoing. And we hear regular news stories now from the US about laws around cannabis being lifted. So, in general, I suppose that has to be considered good news.
Well, yeah, these compounds all, in the U.S. anyway, reside in what's called Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive legal category. And, it's kind of ironic or kind of strange is, that the criteria for a drug to be placed in Schedule in that schedules, Schedule 1 is, that the drug is highly abusable, cannot be used, safely even under medical supervision, and has got, known, medical use. So in the case of the psychedelics, I suppose, it is possible to, make an argument that these drugs, can be abused. But, compared to other abusable, drugs, it's, isn't anywhere, near as big a, public health problem. But, if you consider abuse, taking a substance, which incapacitates you, you can't, drive or operate heavy machinery, those kinds of things. I suppose, psychedelics, could be categorized as abusable. But still, I mean, even as, far back as, my DMT studies, which began in, 1990, the fact that I got, federal, permission and, funding to do my work indicated that the drugs, could be used, safely under medical supervision. And also, in the case of, my study, were being used for a medical purpose. In other words, to understand brain chemistry, understand how these drugs work. And especially within the upsurge of, clinical research with, psilocybin, there are all, kinds of, data, demonstrating that these drugs, can be used, safely under medical supervision. And, they can be used for all kinds of reasons, to treat OCD, to, treat the anguish that's associated with, terminal illness, to treat alcohol abuse, to treat, cigarette dependence. So I think, at some point, that there's going to be either a rescheduling of these drugs into, some place between 1 and 2, where they're still quite, highly, regulated, but, can be used in specific, circumstances or clinics, by highly or specially, trained people. But but they can't, be as easily prescribable as, for example, Valium or, Xanax or, those kinds of drugs. But, I think it'll be, sometime, before, there's a, delegalization of the psychedelics, that's going to be gaining any, traction as, for example, in the case of marijuana.
Well, my just closing thought on this really is that before I ever had a psychedelic experience, I would marvel at the hypnagogic visions that I would have before going to sleep. And just a general thought is that nature doesn't do things for no reason or by accident. So there's somewhere in all of this, there's meaning which we've maybe yet to discover, or maybe we're rediscovering it.
Yeah, I think that's true. A lot of people ask me, what is the purpose of DMT being in the body or in the, thousands of plants, that it's been found in. And, if you look upon that question from a spiritual, top-down point of view, you can answer that question by, saying it's the means that God, has, it's the means that God has, placed within our disposal or at our disposal, to communicate with the divine. So, that is, one answer, to the question of, what is DMT, doing in our bodies and in the plant world. It's, the means of communicating with spiritual realities. And it was designed that way, because, things want to know each other. If you look at it from the bottom up kind of model, though, the neurotheological approach, that can, explain, the reason for things being, so configured from the evolutionarily adaptive point of view. For example, if you, enter into these states, you might be more altruistic or more, creative. But still that kind of, limits, the states, to, ones which, have got, the human being as the center of the universe. And if you look at, the prophetic state, it isn't all, good news. It isn't all happy. It's oftentimes inexplicable. Sometimes it appears to go against, common sense or evolution. So, I think if you're looking at the source, is it the brain or is it God? The panorama diverges quite radically.
Rick, today we've been talking about your latest book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. That's available everywhere. Easily tracked down. Just share folks' details of your website and anything else you'd like to put out there.
Well, sure. Yeah, if you order the book, through my site, it's rickstrassman.com. I will inscribe it and autograph it. Or you can buy it on Amazon, anywhere, Barnes and Noble, or at your favorite, neighborhood, bookstore. It's interesting. If you walk into any bookstore, it's, kind of like my first, DMT book. It's, kind of, it can be hard to find. Sometimes it'll be in the New Age, section. Sometimes the psychology section. Sometimes in psychedelics or drugs. Sometimes occult or metaphysics. So you might even have to ask for it. If you go into your local bookstore.
Excellent. Well, Rick, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, thank you, Greg. It's been a pleasure.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is LegalizeFreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.
I'm the hand of Mona Lisa's skirt. I'm a surprise, Kevin. They don't see me coming.